The Battle of Okinawa stands as one of the most harrowing and consequential episodes of the Second World War, a vast and brutal confrontation that unfolded in the closing months of the Pacific War and came to symbolize the full destructive potential of modern warfare, as well as the immense human cost exacted upon soldiers and civilians caught in its grasp. Fought between April and June 1945, the battle was far more than a clash of military forces. It was the culmination of years of escalating conflict between the United States and Imperial Japan, and it represented the last and bloodiest stepping stone on the path to Japan's home islands. By the time American planners set their sights on Okinawa, the Pacific theater had already been defined by amphibious invasions, fierce resistance, and staggering casualties, yet nothing before had prepared the world for the sheer scale of devastation that would engulf this island. Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, lay just 350 miles from Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's home islands, and its strategic value was immediately clear to American military leaders. Possession of the island would provide a massive staging area for the planned invasion of Japan, known as Operation Downfall, as well as airfields from which bombers and fighter escorts could strike deep into Japanese territory. For Japan, Okinawa represented the final barrier defending the homeland, a last bastion that could not be surrendered without compromising the very survival of the empire. Because of this strategic calculus, both sides approached the coming battle with a degree of determination, desperation, and resolve unlike anything seen elsewhere in the Pacific. As American naval armadas, the largest invasion fleet in human history, assembled off the coast of Okinawa, the Japanese 32nd Army entrenched itself in an intricate web of fortified positions, bunkers, tunnels, and cave systems dug into the island's limestone ridges. Their strategy abandoned the earlier doctrine of meeting landings at the beaches, instead choosing to conserve forces for a prolonged defensive struggle in the interior, where terrain and preparation could inflict maximum casualties on the advancing Americans. The people of Okinawa, trapped between two military giants, faced a future even more uncertain and terrifying. As war swept over their homeland, families fled into caves, endured bombardments, or were coerced by Japanese propaganda into believing that capture by Americans meant torture and death. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe of immeasurable proportions. When American Marines and soldiers landed on Okinawa's beaches on April 1, 1945, they encountered a silence that seemed to defy the expectations set by prior Pacific battles. But this quiet masked the grim reality awaiting them inland. What followed was a grinding, attritional struggle against entrenched defenders who fought not for territory but for time. Time to prepare the Japanese homeland for the final confrontation thought inevitable. The American advance across the island quickly dissolved into a nightmare defined by torrential rains, mud that swallowed vehicles, ridges turned into killing fields, and caves that required flamethrowers and demolitions to clear. Meanwhile, offshore, the U.S. Navy faced an unprecedented wave of kamikaze attacks as Japanese pilots carried out suicide missions with a ferocity that inflicted some of the worst naval casualties of the entire war. Despite overwhelming firepower, superior logistics, and control of the air, the Americans found themselves engaged in a battle that pushed their endurance, morale, and humanity to the breaking point. Units suffered heavy losses, medics worked tirelessly amid the wounded, and commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as each ridge and hillside demanded a price in blood. For the Japanese defenders, the battle was one of hopeless determination. Cut off from reinforcements, short on supplies, and facing overwhelming American strength, they persisted in their defense with the understanding that surrender was not an option. Officers, bound by the code of Bushido and the militaristic culture propagated by the wartime government, urged troops and civilians alike to choose death over capitulation. On the island, fear and propaganda drove thousands of Okinawan civilians to acts of desperation, from hiding in cave networks to committing mass suicides that remain among the most tragic legacies of the battle. As the fighting intensified and the front pushed southward, the civilian suffering escalated into a full-scale humanitarian crisis. Entire villages were wiped out. Families fled from ridge to ridge, seeking refuge that rarely lasted. Children were separated from parents, elders were left behind in the chaos, and thousands died from disease, starvation, exposure, or stray fire. The island's once lush fields and peaceful communities were transformed into a landscape of ruin, scarred by shelling, burned by flamethrowers, and strewn with the debris of war. In late June, after nearly 3 months of unrelenting combat, the Japanese defense collapsed beneath the weight of American firepower and the loss of their command structure, as General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, committed ritual suicide rather than accept surrender. Even then, isolated pockets of resistance continued to fight for days, unwilling to lay down their arms. The cost of the battle was staggering: more than 12,000 Americans killed, over 36,000 wounded, close to 5,000 sailors lost to kamikaze attacks, and an estimated 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed. Yet perhaps the most sobering statistic of all was the loss of Okinawan civilian life. Between 100,000 and 150,000 people, roughly 1/3 of the island's population, perished. By the time the guns finally fell silent, life on Okinawa had been irrevocably changed. Towns, cultural landmarks, and ancestral tombs were destroyed. The island's social fabric unraveled as families mourned their lost members and faced the daunting task of rebuilding amidst ruins. American military occupation would shape Okinawa's political, social, and cultural trajectory for decades to come. Strategically, the battle had profound implications for the direction of the war. The ferocity of Japanese resistance convinced American leaders that an invasion of the home islands would result in catastrophic casualties on both sides. This belief contributed significantly to the decision to use atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a decision that remains deeply debated in historical discourse. For many historians, the Battle of Okinawa stands as the grim turning point where the United States recognized the terrible cost of continuing the war by conventional means. Ultimately, the Battle of Okinawa was not merely a military engagement, but a tragic convergence of strategic necessity, cultural ideology, and human suffering. It revealed the extremes of courage and endurance exhibited by soldiers, the devastating impact of modern warfare on civilian populations, and the complex interplay of decisions that shaped the final stages of the global conflict. The battle demonstrated the destructive potential of entrenched warfare, the psychological fallout of ideological indoctrination, and the immeasurable consequences of a fight carried to its absolute end. As the largest battle of the Pacific War, Okinawa represents both the culmination of years of conflict and a prelude to the war's final, most consequential decisions. Its legacy endures as a solemn reminder of the price of war, the resilience of those who survived, and the responsibility of future generations to remember the lessons forged in its fire. The road to Okinawa was paved with the relentless momentum of a war that had reshaped the political and military landscape of the Pacific. Long before the first American transport ships set their sights on the Ryukyu Islands, the strategic importance of Okinawa had been recognized by both Japanese and American planners. As the largest island in the Ryukyu chain and situated only a few hundred miles from the Japanese mainland, Okinawa was a critical defensive barrier for Japan and a vital stepping stone for the United States' projected invasion of the home islands. The battle for control of the Pacific had already witnessed some of the most brutal fighting in modern history: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. Each conflict teaching the Americans valuable lessons about Japanese defensive doctrine, tenacity, and willingness to fight to the last man. These earlier campaigns made it clear that Okinawa would not only be a decisive engagement, but also potentially the bloodiest. The Japanese leadership understood Okinawa's importance and began transforming it into a fortress designed to extract the highest possible cost from the approaching American forces. Caves were expanded, defensive tunnels were carved deep into limestone ridges, and soldiers were trained to turn the island's geography into an instrument of attrition. Meanwhile, on the American side, planning for Operation Iceberg, the codename for the invasion of Okinawa, began with an enormous mobilization of naval, ground, and logistical strength. The U.S. Navy assembled the largest amphibious assault force of the Pacific War, while the Army and Marine Corps prepared divisions hardened by years of combat. The lessons learned from prior island assaults shaped their preparations: improved naval support, more seasoned landing techniques, greater coordination between infantry and armor, and refined methods for dealing with entrenched defenders. Yet, despite all this preparation, American commanders remained cautious. Intelligence reports indicated that Okinawa's terrain, filled with steep ridges, dense vegetation, and natural cave networks, would be ideal for a deeply layered Japanese defense. As 1945 dawned, global events placed even greater pressure on the impending Okinawa operation. The war in Europe was nearing its final act, and Allied leaders increasingly viewed the Pacific as the final arena that would determine the shape of the post-war world. Japan, though weakened by blockade, bombardment, and isolation, showed no signs of surrender. Instead, its military leadership sought to convince the Allies that an invasion of the Japanese homeland would be so costly that they would be compelled to negotiate peace on more favorable terms. Okinawa would be the stage upon which Japan attempted to demonstrate this strategy. The months leading up to the invasion saw an escalating American air and naval presence around the Ryukyu Islands. Carrier task forces launched repeated strikes on military installations, airfields, and shipping routes, while long-range bombers targeted Okinawa's infrastructure. These operations aimed to weaken Japanese defensive capabilities, disrupt supply lines, and soften enemy positions before the amphibious landings. Despite the intense bombardment, Japanese commanders withheld their main defensive forces, choosing instead to conserve strength for a prolonged ground campaign that would unfold once the Americans came ashore. By early March 1945, the U.S. fleet had massed in overwhelming numbers: destroyers, battleships, escort carriers, landing craft, and support vessels, all converging for what would become the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific theater. The logistical preparation alone was unprecedented. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, construction equipment, food, and vehicles were loaded in quantities massive enough to sustain months of continuous combat. Every branch of the American military understood that Okinawa would not be won quickly, and that casualties would be severe. The Japanese defenders, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had devised a defensive strategy that differed markedly from earlier battles. Instead of meeting the American forces at the beaches, where they would be exposed to devastating naval fire, the Japanese shifted their defenses inland, constructing a series of fortified ridges and interconnected strongholds centered on the now infamous Shuri Line. Landmines, anti-tank traps, camouflaged artillery, and carefully coordinated kill zones awaited the invading forces. Ujishima's goal was not to stop the Americans at the water's edge, but to grind them down slowly, forcing them to pay for every inch of territory with blood. Civilians, too, were drawn into the growing storm. Okinawa's population, largely isolated from the rest of Japan, found itself trapped between two advancing armies. Japanese propaganda had long instilled fear of the Americans, portraying them as brutal conquerors, while the military conscripted young men and women into labor battalions and militias. As the invasion approached, thousands of civilians were pressed into service to build fortifications, transport supplies, and support the Japanese war effort. Many families fled into caves and shelters hoping to survive the coming onslaught. By late March 1945, the air was thick with tension. The U.S. Navy initiated one of the most sustained bombardments in its history, hammering Okinawa with shells and bombs day and night. The horizon was crowded with warships, and the sea churned with landing craft. American troops, waiting in their transports, prepared themselves for another deadly test of endurance. They knew Okinawa would be difficult, but few could imagine the scale of suffering, destruction, and chaos that awaited them. Thus, the stage was set for the Battle of Okinawa, a clash defined by its strategic importance, its unprecedented scale, and the grim determination of both sides. The road to Okinawa had been long and brutal, shaped by years of hard-fought battles across the Pacific. Yet even that experience had not fully prepared the American forces for what they were about to face. For the Japanese, Okinawa represented their final opportunity to turn the tide or at least inflict such heavy losses that the United States would reconsider its plans to invade the Japanese homeland. Okinawa would be the stage upon which Japan attempted to demonstrate this strategy. Dawn broke over the western horizon of Okinawa on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, and with it came one of the most monumental amphibious operations in military history. This day, codenamed L-Day, marked the beginning of the American landing on the shores of Okinawa. For weeks prior, U.S. naval forces had pounded the island with relentless bombardment, turning ridge lines into clouds of dust and sending tremors through the earth itself. Everyone, American soldiers, sailors, Japanese defenders, and terrified Okinawan civilians, believed the landings would trigger an immediate bloodbath. Yet, what awaited the Americans on the Hagushi beaches would shock even the most battle-hardened veterans. As the first wave of landing craft moved toward shore, soldiers braced themselves for machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and suicidal counterattacks typical of earlier battles like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. Instead, the beaches lay eerily quiet. The surf splashed gently against the sand, the wind carried the distant echo of naval guns, and not a single shot greeted the Marines and Army infantry who stepped onto Okinawan soil. For a moment, confusion spread through the ranks. Some feared a trap. Others suspected that the bombardment had annihilated the defenders. But the truth was far more complex and far more ominous than anything the Americans had anticipated. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his staff had made a deliberate and radical decision. They would not defend the beaches. Unlike previous island battles where Japanese forces had died in droves attempting to repel American landings, the Okinawan garrison would remain hidden in fortified positions miles inland. The Japanese high command believed that meeting the Americans at the water's edge would lead to a rapid defeat. Instead, they aimed to draw the U.S. forces deep into the island, where terrain, caves, and defensive layers could be used to maximum effect. The silence on the beaches was not a sign of weakness, it was the calm before a storm of unprecedented ferocity. As the day progressed, tens of thousands of American troops landed without encountering significant resistance. Beachmasters efficiently directed the flow of men, vehicles, and supplies. Seabees began carving roads, airfields, and logistical hubs out of the sand and coral. Artillery units rolled off landing craft and began establishing firing positions. By nightfall on L-Day, more than 60,000 American troops had come ashore, forming a secure beachhead that stretched miles along the coast. The lack of resistance allowed the Americans to advance rapidly inland, capturing the Kadena and Yomitan airfields within hours. These would soon become vital bases for fighters, bombers, and support aircraft that would hammer Japanese positions for months. But despite the quiet landings, danger was never far away. Offshore, the U.S. Navy faced its own nightmare as swarms of kamikaze aircraft launched from Kyushu and other nearby bases hurled themselves at American ships. These suicide attacks, part of Japan's Operation Tengo, marked the beginning of the most intense kamikaze campaign of the war. In the first days alone, dozens of ships were damaged or sunk. The serenity on the beaches contrasted sharply with the chaos raging at sea, where sailors fought for their lives amid burning decks, exploding fuel lines, and plumes of black smoke that stained the sky. While American ground forces pressed forward, they soon realized that the Japanese retreat from the beaches was not a sign of collapse. Reconnaissance patrols probing southward encountered the first traces of the Japanese defensive network, camouflaged bunkers, booby traps, and tunnel entrances that hinted at a far more elaborate system of fortifications awaiting them. Intelligence teams analyzing captured documents and prisoner interrogations confirmed what many commanders already suspected. The Japanese had withdrawn to a massive defensive perimeter centered around the Shuri Line. Yet the early days of the landing gave the Americans opportunities they had never enjoyed in previous island campaigns. Civilians, disoriented, frightened, and uncertain whom to trust, emerged from hiding. Many surrendered to American troops seeking food, water, and protection from the chaos. Medical teams and civil affairs units scrambled to assist them, improvising shelters and distributing supplies. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Americans faced the challenge of managing large populations of civilians during an active combat operation. This humanitarian dimension added complexity to the military mission, stretching resources and creating new logistical burdens. As the Americans pushed inland, they discovered abandoned Japanese outposts littered with ration cans, spent shell casings, and handwritten notes indicating a well-organized withdrawal. Each find reinforced the unsettling reality that the Japanese had not fled in panic, they were waiting. The terrain grew more unforgiving the further south the Americans advanced. Rocky ridges, tangled brush, steep embankments, and limestone escarpments that rose like natural fortresses. Engineers struggled to carve paths for tanks and artillery through terrain that defied easy maneuvering. To the north, the story unfolded differently. The Marines assigned to secure the Motubu Peninsula encountered fierce pockets of resistance. Japanese troops entrenched in the rough, forested slopes fought bitterly before eventually being overwhelmed. The battle for Motubu, though small compared to the carnage that would erupt in the south, offered a glimpse of the tenacity the Japanese defenders would bring to the main fight. Meanwhile, the American command structure worked tirelessly to coordinate the efforts of the 10th Army under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar, Jr. The 10th Army was an unusual blend of Army and Marine units, supported by naval aviation, artillery, and engineering brigades. Buckner's strategy hinged on a two-pronged advance: Marines sweeping north to eliminate resistance, and Army divisions pushing south to engage the main Japanese force. Rapid progress in the north gave the Americans a false sense of momentum, but Buckner and his staff knew the real battle had not yet begun. The eerie silence that greeted the landings persisted for almost a week. During this time, American forces expanded their positions, built supply depots, and prepared for the anticipated Japanese counterattack. But instead of launching a banzai charge, the Japanese maintained strict discipline. Ujijima and his senior officers, including the brilliant strategist General Isamu Cho and the experienced staff officer Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, remained committed to their defensive strategy. They believed attrition, not sudden assaults, was the key to wearing down the Americans. Their men waited underground, conserving ammunition and maintaining readiness as the Americans unknowingly walked into a labyrinth of kill zones. The advance toward the Shuri Line marked the end of the deceptive calm that had defined the early days of the Okinawa campaign. As American forces pressed southward in mid-April 1945, the terrain transformed into a nightmare sculpted for defense. Steep ridges, jagged escarpments, maze-like networks of caves, interlocking artillery positions, and hidden bunkers carved deep into the ancient limestone. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and guided strategically by Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, had orchestrated a defensive masterpiece. Their intention was to resist, delay, and bleed the 10th Army until its momentum slowed to a crawl. Every ridge was a fortress, every valley a trap, every cave mouth a doorway to sudden death. The Shuri Line would become one of the most ferociously contested defensive systems of the Pacific War. For the soldiers of the U.S. 10th Army, the approach to the Shuri Line felt like entering a world where the Earth itself was hostile. The first major obstacle was Kakazu Ridge, a seemingly unremarkable elevation that concealed entrenched machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, and subterranean passageways that allowed Japanese defenders to reappear in unexpected positions even after withering bombardment. Assault companies attempting to take Kakazu Ridge found themselves caught in deadly crossfire. Tanks bogged down or were destroyed by hidden anti-tank guns. Mortar fire fell with uncanny precision. Infantry units pushed forward only to be repelled again and again. Some platoons were reduced to a fraction of their original strength within hours. By the end of the first major engagement, it was clear brute force alone would not break the Shuri Line. Despite the enormous power of the U.S. Navy and supporting artillery, Japanese positions endured bombardments that would have annihilated conventional defenses. Deep cave networks shielded soldiers, munitions, and supplies from even the heaviest shells. When bombardments lifted, Japanese troops re-emerged with machine guns and rifles ready, returning fire with relentless determination. Night after night, the Americans faced counterattacks by small, disciplined units who used darkness to infiltrate forward positions, plant explosives, or launch close-quarters assaults. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became elusive, nerves frayed, and the sense of constant danger eroded morale. The next major struggle unfolded at Sugarloaf Hill, a small, seemingly insignificant mound on the battlefield map that would earn a reputation for horror, rivaling any fought in the Pacific. Sugarloaf was part of a deadly trio of defensive positions, along with Horseshoe Ridge and Half Moon Hill, forming a triangle of interlocking fire. Marines of the 6th Division fought day after day to ascend Sugarloaf's battered slopes, only to be driven back by machine gun nests concealed in the hill's reverse slope. Japanese defenders protected within caves inflicted massive casualties and withstood repeated assaults. Marines described the experience as fighting the hill itself, an enemy that refused to be silenced, no matter how many shells or grenades were poured into its rocky face. Rain and mud compounded the misery. Torrential downpours turned fields into quagmires where vehicles became useless and men struggled to move. Waterlogged foxholes collapsed, weapons jammed, supplies bogged down. As the fighting escalated, bodies, American and Japanese alike, became partially buried in the mud, adding a haunting stench to the battlefield. This environment fostered disease and exhaustion, worsening the already grueling conditions. For the Japanese, life inside the Shuri Line was equally brutal. Soldiers lived for weeks in suffocating caves filled with smoke, humidity, and the stench of unwashed bodies. Rations dwindled quickly, medical supplies ran low, and wounded men lingered in agony. Yet discipline remained firm. The defenders fought with the understanding that Okinawa was Japan's last major barrier against invasion. Their orders were clear: delay the Americans as long as possible, inflict maximum casualties, and prepare for the bitter end. One of the most significant battles of the Shuri Line unfolded at Shuri Castle itself, an ancient royal palace that stood atop a commanding ridge. Though the Japanese used the area around the castle as a defensive stronghold, the castle's cultural importance did not spare it from destruction. The U.S. Army pounded the position with artillery and naval gunfire, reducing the once majestic structure to ruins. American troops advancing toward the castle encountered layers of fortifications, sniper fire from cave entrances, and cleverly concealed firing ports. Even after the castle grounds were seized, Japanese troops continued to fight from nearby tunnels and ridges, refusing to concede ground. General Buckner and his staff struggled to adapt to the difficulties posed by the Shuri Line. Traditional tactics proved insufficient against the deep Japanese fortifications. Engineers and specialized assault teams, armed with flamethrowers and demolition charges, became essential. Each cave or bunker had to be neutralized individually, often through close-quarters combat that left soldiers physically and emotionally broken. It was not uncommon for individual ridges to change hands multiple times in a single day. The cost in lives mounted rapidly, and the 10th Army's casualties climbed far higher than anticipated. The toll extended beyond physical losses. Many American soldiers reported a sense of fighting an enemy who was everywhere and nowhere at once. You could eliminate a machine gun nest only to find another opening few feet away, connected by tunnels. You could take a hilltop only to be shot at from within the hill you had just captured. The Shuri Line became a psychological crucible, testing endurance, courage, and sanity. Letters home described the fighting as worse than anything seen in Europe or earlier Pacific campaigns. Even veterans of Peleliu and Iwo Jima remarked that the Shuri Line surpassed their previous experiences in sheer relentlessness. As May progressed, American forces slowly gained ground. Sugarloaf Hill finally fell after more than a week of continuous fighting. Kakazu Ridge was overrun only after repeated assaults supported by tanks, artillery, and close air support. But every victory was Pyrrhic. Thousands had died for each ridge, and thousands more were injured. Units reduced to half strength were nevertheless ordered forward to continue the push. Reinforcements arrived steadily, but even fresh troops were stunned by the brutality awaiting them. In late May, the Japanese began their final withdrawal from the Shuri Line. General Ushijima, recognizing the impossibility of holding the position indefinitely, ordered his forces to retreat south toward Kiamu Peninsula. Their movement was conducted with staggering discipline. Despite relentless pressure from American forces, Japanese soldiers slipped away through hidden tunnels and ravines, regrouping to form new defensive lines farther south. When American forces reached Shuri Castle and realized the enemy had escaped, frustration rippled through the ranks. The hardest-won ground of the campaign had been taken, yet the defenders remained poised to continue the fight. Nevertheless, the breaking of the Shuri Line marked a turning point in the Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese defensive strategy had achieved its goal, inflicting enormous casualties and delaying the American advance for nearly 2 months. Yet it had come at a terrible cost for both sides. The once green ridges transformed into moonscapes of shattered rock, burned trees, and unburied dead. The sound of battle rarely ceased, echoing across the island like a constant reminder of the immense human cost. The fall of the Shuri Line did not end the battle, but it signaled the beginning of the end. American forces had finally broken the backbone of the Japanese defense, but they knew that the final phase of the campaign, pursuing retreating forces into the southernmost reaches of Okinawa, would be no less brutal. The hell of the Shuri Line had shown them what the enemy was capable of, and what it would cost to finish the battle once and for all. The Battle of Okinawa was not only a clash of armies. It was a catastrophe for the civilians who found themselves trapped between the two most powerful military forces of the Pacific War. More than 300,000 Okinawans, farmers, laborers, elders, mothers, and children, became unwilling participants in a conflict they did not choose. Their island, once known for its subtropical beauty and cultural traditions distinct from mainland Japan, became a battlefield soaked in fire, steel, and terror. The civilian experience on Okinawa remains one of the most tragic and complex aspects of the war, shaped by fear, propaganda, survival instincts, and the brutal realities of modern combat. From the earliest days of the American landings, civilians found themselves engulfed in chaos. Many had already fled their homes during the sustained naval bombardments that preceded L-Day. Villages turned into ghost towns, with residents seeking shelter in limestone caves, ravines, and makeshift dugouts carved in haste. Entire families packed what little they could: rice bags, clothes, ancestral documents, religious charms, and disappeared into the island's network of natural refuges. Life within these caves was perilous. Smoke from cooking fires suffocated oxygen. Water was scarce. Disease spread quickly in the cramped, dark spaces. Yet for many, these caves seemed the only hope against the shells and gunfire that shattered their world above. The Japanese military's presence among the civilian population was a constant and deeply complicated force. Soldiers commandeered homes, food stores, livestock, and tools, often leaving families with nothing. Civilians were compelled to support the war effort, building fortifications, transporting supplies, and providing labor under harsh supervision. Japanese propaganda had long portrayed Americans as ruthless monsters who tortured captives. As a result, many Okinawans feared that surrender meant certain death. This fear became a powerful and tragic weapon. Families hid deeper in caves, fled into jungles, or clung to Japanese soldiers who promised protection even as the tide of war closed in around them. As the American advance pushed southward, the front lines shifted through populated areas, turning villages into battlegrounds. The destruction was total. Artillery and naval gunfire flattened homes, crops burned, sacred sites, shrines, stone tombs, and ancestral graves were reduced to rubble. Animals scattered or died in the blasts. Families became refugees in their own homeland, moving constantly to evade bombardment. The sounds of war, exploding shells, roaring flamethrowers, tank engines, and the cries of wounded soldiers created an atmosphere of continuous terror. Civilian casualties mounted rapidly. Some were caught in crossfire while searching for food or water. Others were struck by shrapnel as they attempted to flee destroyed villages. The caves, despite offering shelter, also became death traps. Japanese soldiers often used them to stage ambushes or store weapons, drawing American attention. When U.S. forces encountered fire from a cave, they responded with flamethrowers, grenades, or demolition charges, methods that brought instant and agonizing death to anyone hiding inside, whether combatant or civilian. American soldiers and Marines, despite fighting a brutal enemy, were not blind to the suffering of civilians. Many accounts describe troops providing food, water, and medical care to families emerging from hiding. Field hospitals treated Okinawan children with the same urgency as wounded American soldiers. Civil affairs units set up refugee camps in the northern and central regions, offering shelter and some measure of safety. Yet these camps were overwhelmed. Tens of thousands of survivors, many wounded, malnourished, or traumatized, arrived daily, carrying stories of terror that shocked even hardened veterans. Some of the most heartbreaking tragedies involved civilians coerced or intimidated by Japanese soldiers into remaining within combat zones. As the Shuri line began to collapse under the weight of American firepower, Japanese units retreated deeper into southern Okinawa, dragging civilians with them or forcing them to remain nearby. Women and children were used as porters, carrying ammunition and supplies across ridges under fire. Others were encouraged or ordered to commit suicide rather than surrender. Japanese officers distributed grenades and instructed families to die with honor. In many caves, mothers killed their children to spare them from what they believed would be unspeakable atrocities at American hands. These mass suicides remain one of the most devastating and controversial aspects of the battle. They were not spontaneous acts of despair, but were heavily influenced by decades of propaganda and direct military pressure. Survivors who chose to surrender often did so in trembling fear, expecting torture or execution. Instead, they found American soldiers offering water, blankets, and medical care, an experience that created confusion and emotional turmoil in the midst of overwhelming grief. As the fighting moved into the southernmost districts, Itoman, Mabuni, and the Kiamu Peninsula, the civilian situation reached its bleakest point. The terrain funneled combatants and non-combatants alike into shrinking pockets of land. Overcrowded caves became scenes of horror, with wounded civilians lying beside dying soldiers surrounded by bodies and debris. The air stank of death, smoke, and human waste. The sounds of bombardment were constant, echoing off cavern walls like thunder. Many civilians attempted desperate journeys through the battle lines. Some waved white cloths as they approached American positions. Others carried children in makeshift slings, praying that mercy awaited them. Some succeeded, others were caught in crossfire or struck by artillery before they could reach safety. The chaos made communication impossible. American soldiers, often unsure whether approaching figures were civilians or disguised combatants, faced agonizing choices in the heat of battle. Amid the suffering, moments of humanity pierced the darkness. American medics treated entire families. Marines shared their rations with starving children. In some cases, U.S. troops carried wounded civilians to safety under fire. These actions, though small in the scale of the war, became lifelines for survivors who had lost everything. They also challenged the deeply ingrained beliefs Okinawans held about Americans, opening the door to trust that had been impossible just weeks earlier. Yet even as American aid saved many, the death toll among civilians continued to rise. Disease spread rapidly through refugee camps. Malnutrition weakened thousands. Explosive remnants of war caused injuries long after the front had moved on. By the time the guns fell silent in late June 1945, the civilian population had been reduced to a shattered remnant of what it had been at the beginning of the year. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest that 1/3 of the island's population perished in the battle. Tens of thousands killed directly by combat, starvation, suicide, or forced conscription into military labor. Every family on Okinawa suffered loss. Entire villages vanished from the map. Cultural landmarks, schools, and temples were obliterated. Generations of recorded family histories housed in stone tombs were destroyed forever. The psychological scars endured long after the war ended. Survivors carried trauma, guilt, and sorrow into the post-war years. Children orphaned by the conflict grew up with fragmented memories of gunfire, hunger, and fear. For many Okinawans, the war was not something they had started, supported, or desired. They were victims, caught in the crossfire of two powerful nations locked in a struggle for dominance. The legacy of civilian suffering during the Battle of Okinawa stands as a haunting testament to the true cost of war. The final phase of the Battle of Okinawa unfolded in an atmosphere of exhaustion, devastation, and grim inevitability. By late May 1945, after nearly 2 months of relentless combat, the Shuri Line had finally collapsed under the sustained assault of the U.S. 10th Army. Yet the Japanese 32nd Army, battered but far from defeated, retreated southward into the narrow, rugged peninsula that formed the last bastion of organized resistance on the island. What followed was a harrowing struggle marked by desperation, sacrifice, and immense suffering. An ending that encapsulated both the tragedy and the strategic significance of the Pacific War's bloodiest battle. As American forces advanced into the southern reaches of Okinawa, they encountered a landscape ravaged beyond recognition. Villages had been reduced to scorched earth, fields churned into mud, and once beautiful hills transformed into jagged silhouettes against smoke-filled skies. The rains returned with renewed intensity, turning roads into rivers of muck. Vehicles bogged down, men slipped on slopes slick with mud and blood. The monsoon season, arriving at the height of combat, amplified every hardship. Yet the Americans pushed on, determined to bring the battle to its close. Japanese forces, now forced into a shrinking perimeter, fortified new defensive positions in the ridges and caves around Mabuni. These positions, though smaller in scale than the Shuri Line, were no less deadly. The Japanese command, led by General Mitsuru Uchijima and assisted by General Isamu Cho and Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, attempted to reorganize their decimated units into a cohesive defensive force. Soldiers dug new trenches, strengthened cave fortifications, and prepared for a last stand. They understood full well that surrender was not an option under Imperial Japan's wartime code. Their duty was to resist until death. American advance became a grueling process of clearing fortified caves and ridges one by one. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, artillery barrages, and close-quarters engagements defined the fighting. Each position required tremendous effort to capture. American divisions, already depleted by earlier battles, suffered continually rising casualties. Exhaustion took a heavy toll. Medics struggled to keep up with the constant stream of wounded. Units rotated through the front lines with little rest. Still, progress was steady, if slow. Meanwhile, the suffering of civilians reached its darkest depths. As combat narrowed toward the island's southern tip, tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians were trapped in the same small pocket as the retreating Japanese forces. Caves overflowed with families who lacked food, water, or shelter. Many fled under fire, carrying children on their backs, searching desperately for American lines in hopes of survival. Others, terrified by Japanese propaganda, stayed hidden behind the front, caught between brutality and uncertainty. American civil affairs units worked tirelessly to evacuate and care for civilians who reached their lines, but the scale of the crisis was overwhelming. Refugee camps swelled to capacity. Medical teams treated wounds caused by shrapnel, burns, malnutrition, and disease. The human tide of suffering seemed endless. In late June, the Japanese High Command recognized that the end had arrived. Their supply lines were gone, ammunition was nearly depleted, and most of their officers had been killed or incapacitated. General Uchijima, adhering to the samurai-inspired military code that governed Japan's war ethos, prepared for ritual suicide. On the night of June 22, 1945, in a cave overlooking the final battleground, Uchijima and General Cho performed seppuku, ending their lives in accordance with tradition. Their deaths symbolized the collapse of organized Japanese resistance on the island. Even after the commander's suicides, pockets of Japanese troops continued fighting for days, refusing to surrender despite being hopelessly outnumbered. Some launched last-minute night attacks, while others chose suicide over capture. It was not until June 25 that American commanders declared the island secure, and not until early July that all significant resistance ceased. The cost of the Battle of Okinawa was staggering. For the United States, it was the deadliest campaign of the Pacific War. More than 12,000 Americans were killed and over 36,000 wounded. Entire units were reduced to half strength. The Navy suffered unprecedented losses from kamikaze attacks. Nearly 5,000 sailors killed and dozens of ships sunk or damaged. The ferocity of Japanese suicide tactics shocked the American military and left deep scars among survivors. The Japanese losses were even more catastrophic. Estimates suggest that over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died during the battle, many fighting to the last man. Perhaps even more tragically, up to 150,000 Okinawan civilians, roughly one-third of the island's population, were killed. Some died in the crossfire, others from starvation or disease. Thousands committed suicide under coercion or fear instilled by Japanese propaganda. The civilian death toll remains one of the darkest legacies of the Okinawa campaign. The physical destruction of the island was nearly total. Homes, farms, Cultural sites and ancestral tunes were obliterated. Forests were scorched and fields rendered unusable. Precious artifacts and historical structures, including Shuri Castle, were reduced to ruins. Okinawa's landscape bore the scars of war for decades, affecting generations who grew up amidst the remnants of the destruction. Strategically, the capture of Okinawa provided the United States with a crucial forward base for the anticipated invasion of mainland Japan. Airfields on the island enabled long-range bombing missions and provided staging grounds for operations that could bring the war to a decisive close. However, the horrific casualties suffered by both sides profoundly influenced American military and political decision-making. Leaders in Washington, including President Harry Truman, understood that an invasion of the home islands would likely result in even greater losses. This grim calculus became a significant factor in the decision to deploy atomic bombs later that summer. The end of the battle did not immediately bring peace to Okinawan survivors. Many struggled with homelessness, hunger, and the loss of loved ones. Families searched for missing relatives among ruins and refugee camps. Communities tried to rebuild with the limited resources available. The island remained under American military administration for years, altering its social and political landscape. For many Okinawans, the war left wounds, physical, emotional, and cultural, that would take generations to heal. Veterans on both sides carried lasting memories of the Battle of Okinawa. American soldiers remembered the mud, the caves, the endless rain, and the enemy who refused to surrender. Japanese survivors remembered the terror of bombardment, the desperation of retreat, and the painful knowledge that their sacrifice had not altered the outcome of the war. Okinawan civilians remembered the unimaginable suffering of being caught between two armies and the irreversible loss of life, heritage, and community. The Battle of Okinawa was more than a military campaign. It was a cataclysm that reshaped the Pacific and influenced the course of world history. It revealed the extreme lengths to which Imperial Japan was prepared to go in defense of its homeland, and demonstrated the incredible resilience and sacrifice of American forces. Most importantly, it exposed the terrible price paid by innocent civilians in modern warfare. When the guns finally fell silent, Okinawa stood as a symbol of both victory and sorrow. The island had been secured, but at an immeasurable cost. The lessons of Okinawa, its courage, its tragedy, and its enduring impact continued to echo through history as a reminder of the human cost of war and the fragile hope that emerges from its ashes.